Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to the City of London.
The City of London.
The next station is Bank. Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
The financial heart of the country.
The City.
The City.
Welcome to In the City.
Stand clear of the doors, please.
Welcome to another week and another look at the stories that are captivating policymakers and power brokers the world over. I'm David Merritt, still in London and in the studio, but this week not alone. We have Allegra and Francine. Good to have you both back.
It's good to
Hi,
be
Dave.
back.
And it's been quite a weekend. After a pretty interesting week, we had the news of the disappearance of the helicopter carrying the president and foreign minister of Iran, and it was confirmed they had both died in a crash, tipping Iran into a period of uncertainty, and the region more broadly, on top of everything that's been going on these past 6 months, another big question opening up.
Yeah, so there are a couple of questions that we're trying to answer. What happens now? What happens to, of course, Iran? We know that there are elections in 50 days. And what's next? So this is also the president that could have taken over the supreme leader in Iran. Iran, because of all the proxy wars in the Middle East, is also crucial to stability or instability.
And the perennial question as well, not to be parochial, is in a week when we expect inflation to finally have come down from 11.1% to somewhere around, we don't know exactly where, but 2%, this kind of magic number. Anything that happens in global affairs to potentially push that number back up is of great domestic interest as well.
Yeah, and we're seeing the markets seemingly shrug off even this latest news. Not only from Iran, but of course I should also mention the failing health of the King of Saudi Arabia, another story we're tracking closely. I mean, Francine, you just got back from Doha, from the Qatar Economic Forum, talking to bank CEOs, executives. How is the region feeling when you're actually on the ground with all of this turmoil, and yet the market's hitting new highs and people seemingly feeling like, it's not going to derail the world economy?
Yeah, so you talk about the economy, and of course they're gaining a lot more influence because of the price of oil. They have a lot of money to spend. They're trying to reinvent their economies. And then you talk about geopolitics, and of course all the stakes are extremely high. Everything's very volatile, as Israel is also pressing ahead with an offensive in Rafah. So if you talk about geopolitics, it's concerning. But they also are sitting on so much cash that they can deploy to try and maneuver their economies. It's almost a bit of yin and yang.
So there's pretty decoupled, right, between this awful state of geopolitics and the kind of investment climate, which seems to be steaming ahead.
Yeah, I mean, longer term, the question is, look, if you're an investor at the moment and you think that geopolitics can quiet down, then it does make sense in investing in the region. If it means that they invest back in your region, there's a little bit of a tit for tat. But if it becomes even more volatile and you don't know what happens with Saudi Arabia, you don't know what happens with Iran, then I guess investors will have to start asking real questions about what also means for this region as a foothold for investment.
I am listening to Francine's globetrotting. So what is it? Qatar and Paris.
Qatar for oil. And geopolitics, and then we had a conversation with Jamie Dimon in Paris.
Whereas I have mostly been in the studio doing our new podcast as alongside this one, Votonomics. And what's interesting from the conversations we've been having in Votonomics is another mismatch between the economy starting to improve and the feeling for so many voters, not just the United Kingdom, but we've also been looking in depth at the American election and then the mood in Germany too.
So we've got our biggest expert in the room here from the London newsroom to dive into all of these questions, our European news director, Rosalind Mathieson.
Ros, what does this mean for stability in the region?
It raises a bunch of questions immediately for both Iran and the Middle East. Obviously, the question for Iran now is that they're going to have elections within 50 days for a new president. And it raises those broader questions also for Iran about long-term succession, given that Raisi, the president, was seen as one of the key likely successors for the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. And so there's that question for Iran and domestic stability. There's also questions for the region because Iran's very busy in the region via a bunch of proxy groups, most notably, of course, in Gaza with Hamas, with Hezbollah. from Lebanon with the Houthis in the Red Sea, and also because of the recent shift in the relationship with Saudi Arabia and the effort to develop diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So there's a lot of things in the mix there. And the question is, how much will a new president potentially change any of that? Or do we see the continuity both at home and abroad when it comes to Iranian policy?
Ros, can you just explain for anyone who doesn't track this quite as closely as you do, the role of the president in Iran? Because obviously the name would suggest head of state, but of course he's not the most important figure there, is he?
Well, that's right. I mean, the president can be quite an influential figure in Iran, but it's very dependent. And in the case of Raisi, he was very much a hardliner, but he took his cues from the supreme leader. And he really came to power on the back of that endorsement, because he came to power in an election in 2021, an election with very low turnout. He was definitely tapped to be a person who would enact that hardline view of the supreme leader. And so has he just been largely facilitating that through his administration? Yes, he was. And did he have much independence in his policy making? Probably not. He was also someone who didn't have a big grassroots network when he came to power. And so he didn't have that kind of household name recognition. He was also pretty unpopular because of the crackdown that he's
Right,
overtaken.
he was called the butcher of
That's
Tehran.
right, because these protests that were against the limits on the rights of women in Iran really kicked off, and he very much was at the forefront of crushing those protests and any kind of broader dissent against the regime. So he's not particularly popular amongst the ordinary voter in Iran. In fact, there was some footage suggesting that people were letting off fireworks at the news of the helicopter crash. So was he someone who represented popularity in the regime? Definitely not. So again, he's not someone who was charting his own course. And that reflects the idea that, again, with the next leader, you want to see from the regime, they want to see continuity and control.
Ros, is there any sense of foul play?
None at all. This obviously happened in terrible weather conditions. The footage is quite stark. It just shows how bad the fog was. I mean, I don't know why helicopters were flying in weather that bad to begin with. It was very foggy. It's now turned to snow. There was a lot of sort of mud that made it very difficult for rescuers to even get to the area. It's very remote. These are old helicopters too. And with the US sanctions, there must be questions over how well those helicopters were maintained. And history shows us that there's been plenty of military crashes in other countries where senior military figures have also been killed, in Pakistan, in India, in Kenya, to name a few. They're notoriously bad and notoriously dangerous. And there's no hint at the moment of foul play. Israel came out quite publicly to say immediately, we had nothing to do with this. But no one at least is suggesting that for now.
What struck me, as you were saying, why these helicopters were flying in these conditions, it's unimaginable that, say, the President of the United States' helicopter would take off in bad conditions like this. They just wouldn't do it. So does it point to a bit of a broader dysfunction with the way that Iran is run, that this could even happen? And particularly, of course, you've got the president and the foreign minister both in the same helicopter and being taken out at the same time. How is that even possible?
Well, that is the question we're all asking ourselves today. Why take off in such conditions? Did he need to be back for something in particular that we don't know about? And they made the choice to fly in the face of that. But as you say, it was the president, it was the foreign minister, it was quite some senior local officials on board as well. It was the head of Raisi's security detail and obviously the pilot and the crew. But there were 3 helicopters in this group and only one of them went down. But I'm sure there'll be questions being asked in Iran today about why they were cleared to take off to begin with.
President Raisi, of course, holds an incredible important position, or he did, because of the proxy wars that we're talking about in the Palestinian territories, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria. But he was also likely the successor of the supreme leader. Who's in the running now?
Well, now it seems like it's the son of the supreme leader who's possibly in the running, and he's someone we don't know a lot about. He's certainly not a particularly public official. The question is, does he become the front runner at whatever point that the supreme leader himself dies? I mean, he's in his 80s now. Or does someone else come out of the woodwork? And there's also that awkward thing for Iran because, of course, after the revolution, the idea of this kind of dynastic rule of having family members take over one after the other really became anathema. And it's been part of the lexicon of the leadership since then to avoid that. And so are they going into a very awkward position where they might have to argue their way around their own actions on that? But it's intriguing because, again, we know very little vocal about his son. He's not taken any kind of particular leadership role in some of the relationships outside Iran, for example. So it is going to enter a very interesting phase when we get to that broader succession question. Is it the son or is it someone else?
Ros, it's a tinderbox, the Middle East right now. How does events of the last 48 hours change it more widely?
I think the most interesting thing will be the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. When it comes to the war in Gaza, you wouldn't expect a change in trajectory there or in the recent step up in tensions between Israel and Iran directly. I mean, the proxy groups are controlled by the military and run very efficiently by the military. They're not really under the purview of Raisi or the presidency. So they'll continue as they are. The interesting thing is the role of Raisi and his foreign minister in that reset with Saudi Arabia. And they were really leading that process. And with the questions, obviously, of the health of the Saudi king in the mix also, that's happening too. And the questions of succession in Saudi Arabia, are you getting into a very awkward moment where you've got succession arising in Iran and Saudi at the same time? And does that change the trajectory of that? I mean, it's been a bit bumpy in the past couple of months in that idea of that reset between the countries, but it's certainly still there. And that, I think, is going to be the most interesting question in all of this.
I was going to ask about Saudi Arabia. In the news, we're also tracking the health of King Salman. But it does feel a bit that the continuity that you all see in Saudi Arabia, you know, with Mohammed bin Salman, of course, effectively running the country already, that you will see more continuity. And it was striking, I thought, to hear the supreme leader of Iran go on state television last night and say there will be continuity. But from everything you're saying, Ros, and with this instability we've seen in Iran in recent months, the protests, the fact that Raisi himself was very unpopular, it seems a taller order, if his son does indeed take over, that Iran can maintain that sort of stability. So the stories are a little bit different, aren't they, in Saudi Arabia and in Iran?
I think it's more short-term instability potentially in Saudi Arabia and longer-term instability potentially for Iran. It'll be interesting to see if things do go very smoothly. As you say, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is effectively running the country in Saudi Arabia at the moment. But handovers in Saudi Arabia are notoriously tricky as well, and we've seen them go awry in the past. So we don't want to presume that happens until it happens, in a way. In the longer term, that is that question for Iran, really, when the supreme leader dies. I mean, whoever becomes president is the continuity question in the short term, but the big one in the longer term is who replaces the supreme leader. And you'd imagine that what they will want above all is that sense again of strong control. You're not going to see revolution on the streets when that happens in Iran, but that's going to be the one that they really need to ensure they get right.
Ross, for Saudi Arabia, is there too much complacency actually in the West that the Crown Prince does automatically succeed his father? And is that why he didn't go on a 4-state visit to Japan whilst his father is sick?
You can read a lot of things into his decision not to go. I mean, the first one is obviously his father is quite ill. And certainly the fact they publicised the fact his father is ill is important. But we've seen, again, lots of game playing go on in Saudi Arabia. I mean, we just look back to the events when a lot of the very extended family were essentially locked up in the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh, that it is notorious for family members conspiring against each other and working against each other. And so, again, you just cannot rule out the possibility that there's some sort of effort in that minute of turmoil when the king does die to try and take advantage of it. So it's probably wise for the Crown Prince to stay close to home right now.
It's been very interesting to see over the last 6 months, no, it's 9 months, that the kind of every time there's been instability or stronger than that in the Middle East, we've all expected it to drive inflation back up and to push against the downward trajectory that we're all seeing and expecting to continue. It's definitely the case that it's not pushed things back up, but that could change at any minute.
And that's really linked to the oil price as well, with oil being linked to inflation. And as you say, there's been this concern that inflation will take a big uptick as a result of these tensions in the Middle East. There's been a concern that the oil price will be pushed up in a sustained way. And interestingly, even when we had that quite stunning moment where Iran fired directly on Israel for the first time, oil didn't move that much. And then when Israel retaliated, it didn't move that much either. And even with all these attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, it's kind of put a floor under oil, but it hasn't really driven it higher. And that's because in the end, there's not been a fundamental change to the picture for supply and therefore demand as well. And unless supply is really properly hit, you're unlikely to see that sustained move in oil and through that, the read through to inflation.
But Roz, with a change in leadership, certainly in Iran and possibly in Saudi Arabia, does that change the energy complex?
It could, because again, the question for Saudi Arabia is what does it mean, if anything, for their policy as an OPEC member? And we've got a meeting on June the 1st, which could prove a little bit contentious already, and the question around quotas in all of that. But given again that the Crown Prince has effectively been running Saudi Arabia, the de facto leader, you may not expect significant changes suddenly in their policy around oil. But it is interesting to see at what point that becomes a broader risk concern for the market, because it certainly doesn't seem to be one at the moment.
Fran, it's something you talked to Jamie Dimon in the last week, didn't you? And it's something he's been pushing as an idea that, we ain't seen nothing yet, essentially, in terms of inflation. Yes, it's coming down, but it could so easily go up, and not just a little bit back up, but back to where it's been, and it's been painful.
My view is that whatever the world is pricing in for a soft landing, I think it's probably half that. I think the chance of something going wrong is higher than people think.
What does that mean? Yeah, it was an interesting conversation. I mean, I had two actually big conversations last week. There was Jamie Dimon, and he was saying, look, there's a bit of complacency in the market, that we're going to see the soft landing in the US, that the consumer is behaving differently. And then if you have an oil shock or an inflation shock, then this changes actually the bets on what the Fed does. The other conversation was we spoke to the Qatar Prime Minister. He's also foreign minister. They have, of course, an interesting role in the region because they're negotiating between Hamas and Israel, and he doesn't really see an end in sight.
Especially in the past few weeks, we have seen some momentum building, but unfortunately things didn't move in the right direction. And right now we are in a status of almost a stalemate. Of course, what happened with Rafah.
And that struck me as, if he doesn't have hope and he's kind of trying to put the negotiations together, we're not sure where we go with this, Roz.
I mean, at the moment, there's no sense that we're getting towards a ceasefire in Gaza. And Qatar, Egypt, the US and others have been pushing heavily for that. But you can see with the movements in Israeli domestic politics, we've got members of Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet saying we're going to pull out pretty soon unless you get some of this resolved, that things are fracturing in Israel. Does that stop Benjamin Netanyahu? Unlikely. If they step aside from their roles in the war cabinet, that could actually bring in more hardliners even. So that could be an extension of the war, or definitely that Bibi pushes ahead with his offensive into Rafah. I mean, it's sort of a creeping slow offensive already, but does that pick up in some fashion? But certainly there doesn't seem to be momentum for a ceasefire on the part of Israel, or potentially on the part of Hamas either at this point.
And when you consider that, Ros, so as you just explained, the splintering of the war cabinet that we're seeing in Israel, so instability at the top of the government in Israel, led on top of the news we're just all absorbing for the last 24 hours of instability at the top of the two dominant powers in the Middle East. Are the markets being complacent here about the escalating geopolitical crisis in the region?
You could argue they are, because a lot of, Fran, to your point about you speak to senior figures in business and markets, and they all seem to warn about it a lot, including, I remember, quite often on the Red Sea and the attacks there, but the markets just aren't really reacting. I mean, I'd throw one more onto that fire, and that's the US election later this year, and the question of who's going to be governing the US next year. Is it a return of Joe Biden, or is it the return of Donald Trump? And that's certainly going, if it's Donald Trump, it's going to take us into fairly erratic territory, one could say, in terms of these key issues around the world. And also his desire to be all up and down in terms of even where the Fed should have rates, where the dollar should be, and so on. So are the markets being overly complacent? Possibly.
It's interesting. Ken Griffin was speaking to Eric Schatzker last week, and he says, Donald Trump would actually be good for geopolitics because people would be so concerned about what he does that certainly a lot of the I don't know if you call them dictators, but some of the strong men around the world would quieten down because they'd be afraid of what he does in retaliation.
Anybody who knows President Trump knows that is not somebody you just push to see what's going to happen. That's the wrong strategy with President Trump. And so I believe that President Trump will have very good people in foreign policy and in the Department of Defense, but I think he will exude a level of strength that will help to stabilize the world in this very, very trying times.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think with Donald Trump, you had to presume whatever he said in that very minute he meant it, and he could change his mind the next day. That was the tricky thing. He'd say one thing, for example, on China or North Korea, I remember, one day, and then he'd say completely the opposite the next day. And you had to presume either of those things could be true in the minute, and that he actually would follow through on those actions. Like when he says stuff like he threatens to take the US out of NATO or not to support some NATO member states if they don't pay enough money, you'd have to presume that could happen. So maybe they do have to take him at his word in the minute, and that makes them less likely to do erratic things in turn.
I think Vladimir Putin called the crash an enormous tragedy. And of course, he called Raisi a true friend of Russia. What will Russia be doing?
They'll be hoping, obviously, for no significant change in Iran from this, because where Iran is right now suits them quite well. They're getting lots of drones from Iran for their war in Ukraine. They're getting a lot of their technology also from Iran for that. They've been strong supporters alongside Iran for states like Syria, for example. And it suits to have them in the tent because you've got nations like Iran, Russia, China, increasingly others like South Africa and so on, just not keen to toe the US line automatically. And for Russia and China, it's about building this block of influence against the West. So for them to have continuity in Iran will be important. They will not want to see any kind of domestic political upheaval. They won't want to see uncertainty in leadership.
On the readout, we sort of have to kind of look across both the reporters but also the commentators. And what you're seeing from the Bloomberg commentators is this idea that right now we're probably already in another Cold War. And the question is how hot it gets. For you running the coverage, is that a characterization you share, or do you think it's not helpful?
We talk about a new Cold War, but I think in that it's important to define what we mean by a new Cold War. It's not the old Cold War slightly reimagined. I'm always cautious about the language around World War III. People talk about a new World War, a possibility of a World War III. That always makes me slightly uneasy. But I do think we are seeing, I guess from the Cold War, the idea was you got blocks. You had two big blocks at least, and the end of the unipolar world where the US is the only superpower. And so are we going into a stage where we're going to a multipolar world with all the complexities that brings around different power blocks? And is that a reflection of a new Cold War? Quite possibly. And being led obviously by China on the one hand and US really on the other. So China replaces Russia in that. So it's probably a version of that, but is it leading to World War III? That makes me a bit cautious.
Thank you, Ros.
It's a relief.
God, I hope not.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I'm in the bunker with my teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not.
Thank you, Ros.
Thank you.
Excellent, brilliant stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's In the City from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, David Merritt, Allegra Stratton and Francine Lacqua. It was produced by Summer Sadi. Show open design and additional editing by Moses Andam. Brendan Francis Newnham is our executive producer, and Sage Bauman is head of podcasts. Special thanks to Rosalind Mathieson. And of course, please do subscribe, rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts.